My name is Erica Sluter, and I'm the marketing strategist here at Optus. And this is our business continuity webinar, part of our webinar series in 2017. And with us, we have Shane Lermo, our engineering manager. We are so lucky to have him. He is a knowledge powerhouse on all levels, and he is going to let you know about business continuity and how you can use it to protect your company. And so before we get started and I turn it over to Shane, I just want to let you know that you're in attendee mode, which means you are in listen only. All of your mics have been muted just to reduce line feedback. If you do have any questions during the webinar, we have a questions and a chat feature over in your sidebar. So please feel free to use that, and thank you to the person, Ben, who told us he was not hearing anything on audio. We really appreciate that. And with that, I will turn it over to Shane.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on business continuity. And just want to thank Erica for that introduction. Of course, you know, as any good engineer, I'll take bribery in the form of candy or whatever. So that's where I got the knowledge powerhouse comment from. I'm assuming was that Snickers bar she was bribing me with there. But in all seriousness, let's talk about business continuity today, because this is an important topic for all of us. And, you know, because it can make a lot of dollars and cents to our organizations. And I'll kind of start out today just talking about, you know, what business continuity means. And luckily, the International Standards Organization, you know, a good organization for defining many of these business processes, kind of defines it as something fairly clear. It's defined as the capability of the organization to continue delivery of products or services at an acceptable predefined levels following a disruptive incident. Now, I may break that down a little bit differently. Now, I'll just say, you know, at its basis, business continuity is really about keeping those essential functions up and running during a disaster and being able to recover those with as little downtime as possible. You know, business continuity considers various unpredictable events, and that's really the crux of it too. For the planning part is making sure that you account for those unpredictable events and looking at how those fit into your business continuity plan. And we'll look at some of those causes here shortly in a couple of slides later. But I also want to mention it's very important, as with any process, you know, to kind of look at the we've all seen the circle design process where, you know, we want to do the analysis. And then after that analysis of what that business continuity should look like, we want to design the processes and the procedures based upon that. Then we need to implement those and, of course, validate and test those. And then the cycle starts back over again with the analysis phase. So, again, very important not just to have a business continuity plan or to consider the business continuity options for your company, but also to test those, make sure those work correctly, especially during a non-emergency event or non-catastrophic failure, because oftentimes you'll discover things through testing that you had not thought of during the planning phase. So that we'll kind of get started, and I think Erica already introduced me, so there's my lovely picture back by the cage where they passed me the Snickers bar right through that wire mesh behind me, if you can see that. But if there's any questions today, I just want to encourage you guys to send out an email at info@optusinc.com. Feel free to follow up with a call as well. We can help you with you know, various aspects of the technologies that we're talking about today, or just answer some general questions about business continuity that can help your organization. And again, I want to thank Erica for putting this together, getting us on the right track, and making this a lot easier to distribute to you guys. As she mentioned earlier, and we may have been on mute at that time, we do have a free giveaway for everyone at the end of the webinar. There'll be like a one-page document, and in true marketing fashion, it's a two-page, one-page document, so you're getting twice for your money. But it's a great little summary on all these things that we're talking about today, some of the different tips and tricks you can use, and some of the key strategies and takeaways from today's webinar. So the first part of business continuity that we want to look at is really, you know, what are the most impactful risks to your company's communication infrastructure? And we're going to talk mostly about communications today. You know, we deal with voice, video, and data, so really those communications are our core wheelhouse, if you will. So business continuity is important for organizations of any size, but it may not really be practical for any but the largest enterprise to maintain all the functions necessary during a disaster. So really the first step is to plan and identify what functions are essential and, allocate that budget dollars and allocate those resources accordingly to those things that make the most sense for your particular organization. Because what may be impactful for one organization may not be so much for another organization. So we're going to look at several of those factors today and several root causes and several solutions, if you will. And again, just keeping in mind that each organization is a little bit different in what their tolerances are. So, what are the most impactful risks? Voice network interruption, losing the ability to communicate outside of a facility, that can definitely be one. And, for example, at Optus, we do a lot of work over the phone. So a lot of business comes in when people call us or when our salespeople call out to individuals. So, the loss of a phone system, for example, could be some pretty significant revenue loss for us, especially if that outage remained for any period of time. But there's all kinds of different outages. And, we'll talk about today, in business continuity, you guys have all probably sat through various webinars or presentations where people are drawing, X's up on a board going, if this fails, here's where it takes over. If this fails, here's where your redundant system is. So it's really all about where they draw that X and where that occurs. And knowing where those failures are most likely to occur in your environment is one important part of this. But, the second item there, system failure, causing the loss of ability to communicate internally or externally. If that's important to your organization, whether it's email, whether that's voice, if you lose internet connection altogether, how does that affect your organization? Data network, just moving between information between your offices or between your employees, how does that affect you? And, how does that elimination cause problems? And then there can be more basic things like loss of electrical power. And some of these causes may have several effects. A natural disaster, loss of electrical power or fire, anything like that could cause all of these things or more. Catastrophic weather events. We were dealing with a casino at one point where they had a flood due to some extensive rainfall, flooded their whole data networking closet, so phone systems, data, everything went down. So, identifying what's critical in that sort of situation allows you to focus on getting those critical functions back up, in a timely manner, and knowing what order to take care of those in that type of event. And there's even things outside of natural disasters or just, failures. Criminal intent plays a large part of many outages. We deal with a lot of surveillance systems, and, those surveillance systems may often record, some kind of a malicious interaction with the criminal element where people are either robbing a retail store or, trying to do something to a property or causing damage. Even some of the surveillance cameras we sell to will be vandal resistant, and they'll often have alerts and alarms so that if you go up and you spray paint a video camera, that may send an email alert because the field of view changes, and that can allow someone to check into that and make sure there's no other outages or with any thefts or just to respond accordingly. But there's all kinds of factors that can cause a risk to your organization. So just kind of knowing what those are, and the main thing is really after you identify what those risks are, prioritizing those risks. And that's going to help us in the next section where we look at how to mitigate those, because some ways you mitigate those risks cost money, others do not. But you've got to really understand what your priorities are and then rank those. What are the most urgent infrastructure requirements for your organization? What are the key applications? Who needs to have communication more than anyone else? So make sure that if you're polling your organization in the various departments, that if a disaster occurs, you not only know what to have spent the money on to make sure that you've got a recovery plan, but also what you're getting back up. What is the priority? Hey, that phone system here may be the most important thing we do. Where another organization, it may be their data network or their their hosting services. So just identifying those, ranking those, will help you with the rest of your business continuity planning. And then also listing out that equipment, and not just having that equipment on a electronic document somewhere that if your servers go down you can't access. So a lot of business continuity is listing out, inventorying the equipment, processes, procedures, ranking those, but then also making sure you've got like hard copies of those somewhere, or somewhere off-site where they're available, so that if a natural disaster occurs or, something happens to that whole geographic location, you've got something to, work off of that's not there on site. So, and I think a lot of that goes back to, we always heard, don't keep all your eggs in one basket. There's a lot of things like, if you've got all your documentation at one location and, you lose that, you could be in for a world of trouble. And then from the IT's perspective, or, the people planning for business continuity, a lot of finger pointing goes on at that point, and that's typically uncomfortable. So, after we evaluate those risks, that's, again, the most important part, identifying what the cost of these risks are. So, we may think one thing is the most important for us, but then identifying, the cost of that. As I said, at a, retail organization, maybe there's a lot of phone orders that come in, and if you can evaluate, and maybe that's, $39,000 a day is what you get via revenue, either from calling in or calling out over your phone system. If you're down for a few hours, what does that look like? And then building an ROI based upon any kind of outage. Because if you're losing, 30,000 plus a day, does it make sense to invest in some redundancy that may cost you 20,000? Of course it does. Now, if that business redundancy costs 200,000, and you've not really had too many outages over the last year, it doesn't look like it makes sense. Maybe it doesn't. So, evaluating those costs, making sure what that looks like, can be very important in what you actually implement. So, let's take a look at really what some of those costs may be, and they're not all financial costs either. But one of the primary ones could be lost revenue during an outage. And the example I gave, if you've got revenue loss, it's pretty easy to calculate what that is. If you're, tracking that. If you're not tracking it, it can be near impossible, and that's, the first step in that business continuity planning. But then calculating that, understanding what makes the most sense as far as covering an outage, whether that's additional equipment, resources, whatever that is. But other than lost revenue, there's legal ramifications or fines that may occur. And, we've all been familiar, probably in this last year or so, or last year sometime, I believe it was, Kerry's Law come out. And that's just regarding, being able to dial 911 from a phone system. And, that's not even if the phone system's not working. That's just that the 911 has to be dialed without any prefixes or anything like that. Much worse if the phone system's not available at all, for example, in a hotel or something like that. So considering any kind of legal ramifications or liability that you may incur, and, a lot of hospitals, things like that, that's very critical for them. They may not have a revenue loss, but, the liability of any kind of outage for data, voice, something like that could be very, very hefty. The other part considers employee lost time. So if you have an internet connection loss at your office, how are you going to function? And what does that cost you? Paying your staff to really not be able to function correctly. And again, we'll look at some of those mitigation risks, but understanding what that cost is important, not just from revenue, not just from liability, but, any current resources that you're employing that are not, able to where you're not able to recoup that revenue, if you will. And of course, like a loss of public trust or lack of confidence. And one good example I'll give there is, I think it was back in February, if you guys remember the Amazon cloud services. When that went down, Amazon had a lot of big names on their web hosting. And, those systems went down. They lost connectivity, and, that hurt Amazon at that time. And, Amazon's a powerhouse, and I'm sure they'll recover, but that cost them a significant amount of revenue due to that outage. And I'm sure they had some, multiple databases and things like that. And, there was just some part of that disaster recovery someone did not consider. There was a human element that, allowed a single point of failure in their kind of business continuity plan. So, in that public trust, even though it's not an immediate ROI, you can definitely see it in the profitability of that company, in the months to follow. Same thing with Target a few years ago when they were hacked into, not necessarily a system outage, but that loss of public trust can be very, very costly, and even times more so than any revenue for the outage itself. So these are some of the key factors just to be aware of, and, as you're identifying those risks, associating costs for those risks and helping make sure that you're prioritizing accordingly. So now the key section here is, how do I mitigate those risks? And this is, there's a lot of different options here, and we're going to talk about just a few today. But we've established the first two things. We know what my critical processes are. We have a rough idea of what those losses could be, and now we just need to look at where to implement these changes and how do I mitigate these risks with solutions, processes, etc. So a few things we'll be looking at today is, and we'll go into more detail later, but utilizing different companies or technologies or infrastructure to provide backups or dual paths. And that's been around forever. It's just even back in the servers, people still say today, hey, there's 2 NIC cards, hey, there's 2 power supplies, but just dual capability, backups, if you will, whether that's a service provider, whether that's your cable, whether that's just your CRM, whatever services you have. Is there more than one way to get that? Is there more than one service? Creating failover sites too. So we talked about the casino that we dealt with at one time. Due to a major flood, they just lost about everything, and that was mostly in one. It was locally, regretfully, in their data closet. So the equipment, everything outside of that was pretty much fine. All of the equipment in the data room, which controlled everything, was out. And that was a single site. There wasn't a disaster recovery location or anything like that. So oftentimes in those single site scenarios, you've got a huge single point of failure if you don't have equipment for that to go out to the cloud or another geographically diverse location. And sometimes, again, we just need to establish if it makes sense to invest in that. But I know for these guys, for example, that would have made a huge amount of difference for them. The cost would have been very minimal compared to their losses during that outage. And utilizing equipment, like we said, with multiple processors or fault-tolerant architecture, the dual NIC cards, the dual power supplies, and all that kind of good stuff there. As well as identifying critical functions, creating a higher level of resiliency for the operation. So a lot of different things we can do here. And, really, I heard one gentleman describe business continuity as just common sense. And oftentimes it is. It's just really thinking about, what you're doing. And regretfully, we had an issue with the audio in here earlier. But one thing that I was wondering, I come to a different location for these webinars, so I bring the laptop with me. And just thinking about that, I was like, well, hey, I'm on wireless, but just in case, I'm going to plug into a hardwired network connection because I want to make sure that my laptop doesn't lose internet connectivity. That's just an additional form of backup to make sure I've got. Hey, my laptop may have 4 hours of battery in it as well, but I brought the power cord because I want to make sure, it doesn't go dead during the middle of the presentation. But just thinking through those processes and redundant or dual paths will help identify a lot of those things. And oftentimes, those don't require additional dollars. I've seen companies buy, we've talked about the servers a couple times. Hey, they've bought a high-dollar server with dual NIC card, dual power supplies. And then regretfully, what they do is those NIC cards have been plugged into the same switch. That switch fails, you've got a single point of failure. Best practice, you want to route one to a different switch if it's possible in that location. That way, one point of failure doesn't occur with that data switch locally. Same thing on the power. If you plug that in the same electrical circuit or the same UPS and that goes dead, you've got that single point of failure again. So plugging that on a separate UPS and preferably a secondary electrical circuit. That way if the breaker blows or anything like that, it's not all plugged into the one power supply or the one power, and it doesn't matter that you've got 2 power supplies. So just thinking through those processes, and even if you've invested in technology, making sure that there's multiple paths for all of that to get access to the outside world or to the power, anything of that nature. So let's look at some of that external connectivity that we just talked about. And one of the first ones we talked about was the carrier services and cabling and stuff like that. So using a combination of various outside connections, like, maybe you've got AT&T or Verizon, but also you may want something from Time Warner Cable for a backup for your internet, or maybe there's some wireless trunking. SIP trunks do a good job of having some resiliency, redundancy as well. And we'll talk about all these in a little bit more detail in just a couple slides. But one thing I like about SIP trunks is oftentimes if they fail, you can fail over to a cell phone. So even if all your phone system dies on premise, if you work that out with a carrier, those may reroute over to predefined cell phone numbers. So, you could be at home, you could be somewhere else, and still conduct business. Now, the thing to consider there is just thinking through it. I'll use the Optus example earlier. If our phone system went down, hey, we get a lot of business from inbound calls. But you also have to consider the outbound. So in this scenario with SIP trunks, I'd still receive all my inbound calls, but I may not, the outbound calls may not show up as the right information, or I may not see the right trunking. I may not have access to everything. So just making sure that, you consider all the different possibilities. But, SIP trunks, if you're not using those today, I'd highly advise you to look into those. Usually it's a win-win, because oftentimes they cost less than your traditional trunks, and then there's a lot of extra features, especially with resiliency and redundancy as well. And if you've got questions about that, we help coordinate those SIP trunks all day long here at Optus. We'd be glad to answer your questions or provide some recommendations for you from some companies that can take care of those services for you. And then cloud solutions. Again, we'll talk a little bit more in a minute, but, having things that are out there in the cloud, there's often, carrier-grade applications that, have multiple data centers and fail over. And, you don't necessarily have to be at the office to have those work for you. So, and there's some good things and some bad things, and we'll talk about here, we talked about telco earlier, and, that's usually great for primary, secondary circuits, both voice and data. And I know a lot of people that look at secondary carriers, like, hey, I brought in AT&T, but, as a redundant option, I want to bring in a Verizon trunk as well. That could be good, but it could be bad as well. Oftentimes you want to consider, again, we talked about where you draw the X at. If that failure is in the last mile, where most typically are, if that's over the same lease lines, like if AT&T really owns the local last mile there, and Verizon is just leasing that from them as well, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to get, two carriers in there, if that last mile is the same. So, before you do something like that, just validate that, again, there's not that single point of failure. If that last mile is the same, don't invest in it. If it's different, it might make all the sense in the world. But things like cable, that's a great secondary option, because usually that's on a totally different network than your carrier. So, that's a good internet backup for you as well. And then, again, being typically in different networks, the last mile, if you will, is different. So, oftentimes makes a lot more sense than a secondary carrier. And also, if you've got that as a network, making sure that it's programmed to seamlessly migrate or change over during a disaster recovery. And again, that goes back to testing and making sure that's working correctly as well. Some other options are, wireless. And one thing that we see a lot of companies doing now, and that we help strategize with a lot of our national accounts, is, like wireless routers. And there's multiple devices that you can put out on site that may have LTE cards, so that in the event of an outage, whether that's your primary service provider or even your secondary, this gives you a wireless option to get out on. Now, the bandwidth may be more limited there than what you're needing, but again, that could still take care of some critical functions for your organization. And these are usually very low-cost solutions to get you going. There's a little bit of complexity in making sure you get the right devices, the right bandwidth, and different plans that you can set up or on demand. But again, we could definitely walk anyone through if they've got questions on that. But a great option, and we see this a lot in our retail sites that we deal with, because it's very economical, very powerful, and even in some areas, as an engineer, I don't like to see this as my primary option, but in some remote areas, I see customers using this as their primary internet connection, because there's no fiber, there's no good network connectivity out there. And so this wireless option, it could be the best option they have due to their geographic location. So, that allows you, again, to provide that ongoing data connectivity, and it's all about, that outage, where we draw an X, and then, keeping that customer up and running. Lots of devices out there today, so looking at these for your business continuity plan can definitely make a lot of sense. Satellite, last thing we'll kind of talk about here in this category. It's pretty pricey, but the carriers can provide this to you, and depending on the cost that we established earlier, this still may make sense for you. It's definitely a proven option. It's solid. You can use phones, you can get data, it may be the highest cost per minute of the other options, but if this is the only option you have, it could still be more than your estimated losses based on an outage. And oftentimes, we've seen in the past if there's a federal disaster area declared, some of your funding for this stuff may be offset with some of those costs as well, or some of those funds. So a lot of different options for your trunking, your internet connections, and if you have any questions about any of those, again, we'd be glad to talk to anyone on an individual basis about those. I want to talk about SIP trunks, and we talked about earlier, going to cell phones on those as well, and that's definitely a great option. And other than the cell phones, though, they're easier for a carrier to move. So as opposed to, for example, a traditional PRI that's kind of hardwired, if you will, there's a hard physical connection going to your business. Say you have multiple sites, you can move SIP trunks. Your carrier can easily move that because it's an Ethernet connection. There may be some work at their back end, but working with your carrier to plan for that ahead of time can definitely save you a lot of downtime in the event of an outage at that location. Where if you've got more traditional trunking, analog trunks, PRIs, T1s, you're not moving that physical connection. Everyone's probably placed orders for those sort of services at their locations. That can take weeks or months even to get that kind of physical move taken care of from most carriers. So again, if geographic redundancy is a good option, you've got equipment at multiple locations, moving those trunks from one location to another with SIP trunks is a great option that you would not have, again, with traditional trunking. And even at a single location, you've got some benefits like bursting, where you can go beyond the normal number of circuits. With like a PRI, maybe you only have 23 circuits, and it's not necessarily a part of disaster recovery or business continuity, but that inbound call traffic can mean dollars and cents to you, and bursting can allow you on SIP trunks to go past, the normal capacity you may have. So again, saving or making your business or organization money. And then again, filling over to a wireless network with SIP trunks as well. Lots of good options, and again, this is one of those, I'll call it a no-brainer in most cases, because the cost is usually not more, usually it's less than what you're paying for your traditional trunks. So if you're not looking into this, I greatly urge you to do so, and again, give us a call if we can assist at all. So looking at cloud solutions, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, the great thing is you can easily access these from multiple locations. So if our main office went down here at headquarters, for example, our sales team have laptops. They could work from home. They could access a lot of our cloud applications regardless of where they are. So if we have flooding and the building has to be closed down, for example, we use Salesforce, cloud-based solution. Our guys can work remotely wherever they're at. They can go to, Starbucks, they can work from their house, etc., and not have to be impeded because the system here went down. There's, again, often high levels of resiliency with that, because companies like Salesforce will have multiple data centers where, you can home back to. So, if there's a catastrophic outage on their end, they've usually heavily invested in their infrastructure to make sure that they've got, a lot of resiliency built in, because, that's something they have to do due to the competition out there and just provide the services that people demand today. So, oftentimes you don't have to look at building the infrastructure out yourself. If you're looking at cloud solutions, oftentimes it makes sense to, invest in other companies that have that built in for you already. So just making sure, that you have any connectivity issues at that individual site, because oftentimes, there can be dependencies on that. An example I used, if you didn't have, laptops or a mobile device or something that you can connect to the cloud, it's still not going to do you any good. So, if everyone has desktop computers and they don't have access to that phone at home or anywhere like that, they have to find some equipment to make sure they've got that connectivity. Which kind of touches on the last point. A lot of apps will have, a lot of true mobility options. Salesforce is a great one of those. I'm not a sales rep for Salesforce, but they've really done a great job of making sure that you can get connectivity not just from anywhere, but from a multitude of devices. So, as you're looking at cloud solutions, that's an important part of that is not just the cloud itself, but those endpoints that it connects to, whether that's a laptop or a phone or whatever that may So looking at some of the last thing is really, the on-premise survivability solutions, and these are some of the things I talked about before, kind of like the hardware redundancy with, multiple NIC cards and multiple power supplies and hard drives. And, we all hear about like RAID controllers and things like that. So just making sure that, your critical systems have this hardware redundancy, because that's very important as well. You don't want, one hard drive to cause a failure for all of your systems. And again, you don't want to have your NIC cards pointed on the or connected to the same Ethernet switch, or your power supply is connected to the same electrical circuit. But making sure that you've got hardware redundancy where that makes sense, again, is a great idea. Looking at that local survivability as well. So if you lose a standalone site, does another node come up and have connectivity to another location? We've got a lot of customers that may have a on-premise solution, but if that particular system or box dies, it can home back to another location if needed. Or even if it's homing back over the internet for its primary primary functioning, it can have a local survivability option there as well in case of a WAN outage or something like that. Of course, generators, UPSs, solar panels, lots of things to augment your power supply. It's not just all about network connectivity, but anything that your organization needs to have that geographic redundancy or that that resiliency, if you will. We kind of talked about multiple cores. Having data centers is an option. So even if you're a single site location, it oftentimes may make sense, and it would have for that casino, for example. Even being a single site location, you can rent space in a data center, and maybe you put all your equipment out in the cloud, and that way, in case of an outage, for example, our IP phones could connect back to that redundant system. Their networks can connect back to some other servers and storage servers where their data was kept at. There was some database redundancy in place. But, looking at a hosted data center is definitely a key option, even if you are in a single site environment, because you don't want a disaster to take down your entire organization and not have any access to all of your information. Virtualization is great. I can't talk enough about that. We could spend a whole hour talking about that. But the great thing about virtualization is it's very cost effective. Sometimes hardware redundancy comes at a cost because you're having to buy so many different pieces of equipment. Virtualization, especially if you're using things like VMware with high availability, you can often spin up another instance. You have to have some other core servers somewhere, but you can spin up another instance of your equipment. It often keeps the same IP address, so all your peripherals still connect. And there's not necessarily a lot of cost involved in that when it's not used. You can run multiple systems on that same virtual backup, if you will, and just whatever systems fail over or whatever you've deemed as your critical systems. But definitely worth looking at virtualization, and so many technologies today are taking advantage of that. And oftentimes you can get better redundancy with virtualization than you can with hardware redundancy at a site, just because it's so much more flexible, and so much of the networking aspects kind of keeps everything together, and the uptime can be minimized as well. So lots of different things we've talked about there, and I think one of the key things, though, with any of this, as we're getting close to wrapping up here, is, as I said, after your analysis and you identify what some of those key aspects are that we need to back up or need to have business continuity for, understanding those costs so you can make sure you have those, but then testing that and validating that and making sure it's working. The best continuity plan in the world, if you don't test it, is going to have an unexpected outage, because there's so many aspects that it's hard to think of anything and everything that could happen. So, that kind of concludes the information I think we had to talk about today. So I'll pause for a second, take a breath there, and see if we have any questions from the audience.
We don't have any questions right now, but while I finish up, kind of letting you know where to find that one-pager, I encourage anyone, if you have any questions, please put them in the questions or the chat tab, and we would be more than happy to answer those. And if you have questions after the fact, please email us. The email address is on the screen, info@optisinc.com, and we can get that directly to Shane, and he will be able to help you out. And so if you will look in the right-hand side on your menu tab over there, we have, under the handout section, is the Office Business Continuity one-pager, which is really 2 pages, that kind of gives you an overview of what we discussed today and a little bit of, what to take into consideration when creating a business continuity plan for your business. And that is really all that we have for the business continuity webinar. We had one person, Jana, said thanks, Shane, so we appreciate that comment, Jana. And you all will receive a pop-up survey whenever this webinar closes out. It's 5 questions. It'll take you 30 to 60 seconds. We would appreciate any feedback so we can keep this webinar series going.
We want to thank everyone for their time today, and again, we appreciate your attendance. If there's anything we can do for you, as Erica mentioned, just please feel free to reach out to us.
Wayne, we had one more question. He said that his internet cleared a few minutes ago. Is it possible to get these slides? Yes, for everyone who attended today, I will send out this slide deck to everyone along with the one-pager, just in case you can't find it or it's not downloading for any reason. So we will get that. We have a bunch of good job, Shane. Awesome. So we appreciate that. Thank you, guys. And that is the end of the webinar. Be sure to join us next time. Look for that email.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good day.